So, you want to know how to focus on your gimbal? That's handy, because I got you covered, mate. Going on, you lot? I hope you're all sweet. Yeah, I've got a little bit of a confession to make. Basically, I do not focus when I use a gimbal. I know, madness, right? But easily the most frequently asked question I ever get is, are you using autofocus? How did you keep your focus when you was using the gimbal? Like, how are you doing it? Now, typically there's one particular rule that I always keep to when I'm shooting on a gimbal, and it's actually a lot more simple than you think. I personally don't really like to use follow focus systems. It's an extra thing that you've got to set up when you're out on the field. If you run and gun like I am, mate, I just want to be blitzing about, doing what I can, because usually I'm stuck for time. I want to shoot at sunset and things like that. And I don't want to be setting up an extra piece of equipment that essentially doesn't need to be set up. If I actually focused on the movement and what I'm trying to tell in the shot rather than worrying about where my focus is, for me, that is going to create a better story and essentially a better video. So then, let's get straight into it, and I'm going to teach you how I keep my focus when using a gimbal. So as you'll know, every single lens will actually focus using distance. So let's say that your lens is here and you've got a distance. Let me make this a bit easier. See these two people here, yeah? So this is me. Certainly looks like me, and I'm definitely using the ZHIYUN Crane Plus here, yeah? And this is 2Bob. Now 2Bob just so happens to be me subject in my scene. So yeah, as you can see, this is my scene. So here's me, and I want to shoot 2Bob over here. And this elastic band here, this is representing the distance. So let's say at this point here, we are at 5 meters, yeah? So this elastic band is representing 5 meters of distance. Me over here with my gimbal and my camera, I have set my focus for 5 meters. Now, 2Bob over here, who's my subject, is sitting at 5 meters away from the camera. So for me to keep my focus, I need to stay at this distance from 2Bob. Now, if I was to come closer to 2Bob, we're out of focus. If I was to go further away than 5 meters, now we're also out of focus. So I've got to keep that sweet spot there at 5 meters. So any kind of shot, including the gimbal, like a tracking shot or a reverse tracking shot, I will make sure that I keep my 5 meter distance, or whatever the distance may be, to my subject. So let's say that I'm actually tracking 2Bob as he's walking through a scene. So we go this way, we're tracking. Yeah, making sense? Now, as long as I keep that distance, 2Bob is always going to be in focus. Now, this is the exact same kind of scenario if we're doing like a rotational shot or an orbit shot. So if 2Bob, the subject, is here and I am over here, I am going to rotate myself around 2Bob like so, and I'm going to keep that 5 meter distance, because over here, that 5 meter distance is the same as here and as here. And all the way around if I was to do a full orbit. If I was to come round an orbit and get closer to 2Bob as I come round, 2Bob is obviously going to be out of focus. So what I need to do is make sure that I keep that 5 meter distance wherever I am from 2Bob. Yeah, is that making sense? I thought this little diagram might, well, I'm going to call it a dynamic diagram, might actually be a bit more kind of educational rather than me just talking about distances, because I ain't very mathematic. If I can see things, it makes it easier. So let's go back in. So keeping that rule there will actually allow me to keep 2Bob in focus the entire time. But then again, what happens if I wanted 2Bob to walk towards the camera or walk away from the camera? Now, essentially, 2Bob or the subject is going to go out of focus at some point if you want to do that kind of shot without having a follow focus or autofocus. Now, I personally don't want to use autofocus because the camera, for me, is too unreliable. It hunts for the focus and I just don't like it. It just looks dodgy. I personally would rather keep my focus distance and have them come in and out of focus, depending on if that makes sense for the story. Now, a typical scenario where someone coming into focus would make sense is if we don't know who the character is yet and we're introducing the character. So if they're out of focus in the frame and then all of a sudden as they walk towards the camera or the camera pushes towards them, they come into focus, it's almost like we're revealing or we're introducing this character into the scene. So there is certain opportunities that I don't mind having my subjects out of focus when I'm shooting on a gimbal. But if I can, I try and make sure that it fits the storyline instead of just not making sense. Why are they out of focus now? Why are they in focus? Because it actually takes your mind away from the story and puts it onto the dodgy use of the camera focus that you've obviously done wrong. So as long as it's staying true to the story, you shouldn't actually notice the cinematography. So when I'm shooting a subject, that is essentially how I make sure that I keep them in focus. Now, hold your horses, James. What happens if you're shooting a static subject or a building or a location? Unbelievable question. Mate, unbelievable castle. So here's our static subject, and it's a castle. Now, for argument's sake, let's say that this distance is actually 20 meters. So here we go. We've got our 20 meters. That is where the focus point is going to be. Now, if I was to push in on this location, on this static building, obviously that 20 meter focus point is actually going to be somewhere over here by the time we're halfway to the castle. So when I'm trying to shoot a location or a static kind of building, I will always try my best to shoot that location wide. Now, when you shoot wider, you don't have such a shallow depth of field. Your depth of field is a lot deeper. So a lot more of the frame is actually in focus. And I always try my very best when I'm shooting static locations wide to keep my aperture relatively high. This is going to allow my depth of field to be a lot deeper so that I can get a hell of a lot more in focus. This allows me, when I actually push the camera forwards towards the location, it is pretty much going to be in focus the entire time because my depth of field is actually a hell of a lot deeper. What if you've got low light? What if you're struggling with the amount of light that you've got? Because increasing the aperture is going to make your shot a hell of a lot darker. I know. That is why I obviously shoot on the Sony a7S Mark II. It's great in low light and that's why it works for me. That's why I particularly like this camera and it works with my setup and the kind of things that I shoot. So that is a reason that I actually love using the Sony a7S. There is tons of other cameras that are brilliant in low light, so don't just kind of limit yourself to this one. There are loads of incredible cameras, but mainly the a7S II is kind of the king at doing low light. So that's why I don't mind increasing my aperture because I can bump up my ISO to about 25,000 if I need to in certain situations. And that allows me to keep high aperture so that my depth of field is much deeper and I can keep a lot more in focus. So people, that is how I keep my focus using a gimbal. Sorry I decided to use this silly little diagram. I thought it just might help a little bit better. Let me know in the comments if that actually worked because I'd be very, very surprised if it actually did. Anyway, people, thank you very much for watching and I'll be catching you in the next video, I guess. So, yeah, peace.